I'm joined here with Noddy Sharma. How are you going?
I'm really well, thanks, Caleb. How are you, man?
Yeah, doing well. I was gonna go say it over in sunny Perth, but it's been a bit heading into winter, so a bit colder on these mornings over here. You're in Sydney, right?
Melbourne. I'm in Melbourne.
Melbourne. You're
So
yeah,
not
how
so sunny. Melbourne.
I'm really looking forward to the conversation ahead. Something I like to do with my guests is just bring some flesh to who they are. Humanize them a bit for our listeners, perhaps who can't see your shining face. So maybe you can maybe you can share two things. One is, what is something that people may find surprising about you, and then the second one is, obviously this is we have gospel centered conversations with people who love Jesus. So what is the story of how Jesus has transformed your life?
Two big questions, mate, and good ones to start with, right? So I think the surprising thing about me is I missed out on the Aussie Open by a shot playing golf full time, when I came out of uni and stuff. And it was one of those defining moments that brings pain and joy in retrospect, right? Pain in the sense of your dreams shatter in a moment. You think, oh my goodness, this is never going to work. And, it just all comes tumbling down. But when you look back, you see God's hand in it. And that led to me doing an internship at a church where I was on staff there for about 8 years. And it just kept going from there. And you couldn't orchestrate this stuff, right? So looking at the way that God worked was incredible. So there's something that probably, is a bit of a surprise about me.
Yeah.
And then in terms of encountering Jesus, you know what? I came out of a troubled youth background. My dad had died when I was almost 9 years old. Everything just kind of came collapsing down in my world. Found myself in some bad company and just was a long way away from God. And it's not that I ever thought that he stopped existing. It's literally that I felt like, you know what? I can't reconcile God telling me he's a God of love when he would take away my dad, who was my Superman. And so
Wow.
it's almost like I even subconsciously decided I'm going to actively work against him and prove that he isn't a God of love. And I remember at 18, I'd met some guys who were beautiful Christian men, young guys, and it didn't matter how rough I was around the edges, it didn't matter how rude I was to them, they just kept turning up.
Wow.
And eventually I saw the fingerprints of God in their life, and I just recognized that I want that in my life. And so I just had this moment where I encountered Jesus, and at 18 it just changed everything. And it was like this radical, almost Paul moment of that Damascus Road thing, of encountering Jesus and just watching myself be completely transformed over the next 3 months. Now, still a work in progress, right? Like there's always stuff that Jesus is doing in us, but that moment for me when I encountered him at 18 was pretty spectacular, and something I look back on and am very grateful to God for.
That's amazing. Two quick thoughts on that. Well, rewinding just a slight second in terms of, so you mentioned you missed out the Aussie Open by a shot. For those listening, you're not referring to tennis, right? You're referring to golf.
No, yeah, I'm referring to golf. So, and I'm talking like a long time ago now, right? So, we're talking 26 years ago. So it's a long time ago. It's a long time in
Right.
my past. But yes, those moments in life where the disappointment is so big that it will last a lifetime. That was that moment for me.
That's incredible. It's not every day I get to talk to a professional, ex-professional golfer, so that's very
X.
interesting. Yeah. Do you still have a swing every now and then?
Yeah, I still play, and I still enjoy it. It's good fun. It's a good sport that you can play for a long time. So yeah, I still enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, very cool. So you hit 18. Yeah, God obviously radically transforms your life, your perspective, the direction you're headed. So bring us to this present day. What do you find yourself doing, and why have you started doing what you're doing?
Yeah. So again, great question, man. Um, from that moment when I encountered Jesus, and then missed out on the Aussie Open, ended up in church. I pastored in churches for about 12 years. Then I had this moment with God where I just felt like, and it coincided with turning the same age my dad was when he first got cancer, right? And
Mm.
he battled with it for about 5 years, and then passed away at 39. And
Wow.
um, and I remember on my 34th birthday, kind of waking up and I was just overwhelmed. I couldn't stop crying. And when I looked at it, the reason, when I stopped and reflected was that before Dad died, he'd written me a letter. And in the letter, he'd outlined all his hopes and his dreams for my life.
Mm.
And I realized by the age of 34, I'd pretty much subconsciously checked off all those things on that list. And I really wanted to hear
Wow.
him say he was proud of me.
Mm.
And I knew that in this lifetime, I wouldn't hear that. And I was just deeply sad, Caleb. I just didn't know what to
Mm.
do with it. Anyway, I end up being invited to preach at a friend's church, for their anniversary weekend. And the whole weekend, it was full on. At the end of it, I'd been praying this prayer for the months leading up to it of God, take this away from me, show me that it's your voice that I need to be chasing. It's you that I need to know that's proud of me. And give me the courage to say yes for whatever's next because I'm acutely aware that time can be short.
Wow.
And at the end of that preaching time, a guy comes and he sits down next to me straight after the church service, and it just sits just that little bit too close. Those moments of like, oh, what's going on here? And
Right.
I literally just had this God moment of him dropping into my head and just saying, "Hey, shake this man's hand. I'm about to give you a gift."
Mm.
And I reached over and I shook this guy's hand and I said, "Hey, I'm Noddy." And he turned around and he goes, I know who you are. In fact, I knew your dad." And the minute
Wow.
he said that, my ears pricked up. I'm like, "What? You knew my dad?" And he started talking about the fact that when he was a young man, like 19, he went on this work party to Papua New Guinea where my dad was a pilot. And he said, "Your dad was one of the first people that I met." And I just observed him, got to know him. And all I could see when I looked at him was just Jesus. He
Mm.
goes, the way that he spoke to people, what he did, the choices he made, the way he turned up. He goes, it was incredible. He said, so much so that when I got back from that work party, I became serious about my faith. And I thought, I want to be
Wow.
like that man. And he said, I just want to tell you that I've listened to you speak all weekend. I've watched how you interact with people. And a lot of what I saw in your dad, I see in you. And I just want you to know he'd be really proud.
Oh, wow.
And, so of course I burst into tears, right? I'm like, man, that's incredible. And he looked at me like, what just happened? I told him everything that had been going on, gave him this big hug. It was an amazing moment. Anyway, I'm on the plane coming home. And again I encountered this moment with God that will stay with me, until I see him face to face. And it was almost like this conversation I had with him where he just said, don't you think it's amazing that you only knew your dad for 9 years? And I'm like, amazing and sad. He said, yeah. He said, but even though in that 9 years you haven't seen him for all these years later, someone can still recognize similarities between you. I'm like, yeah, that's incredible. He said, that's DNA. It's one of my favorite things. He
Yeah.
goes, but
Wow.
let me tell you why my voice is more powerful and why it's more important that you hear from me. He said, because you only knew your dad for 9 years, but Noddy, I've known you since the beginning of time. I've known you from the moment you were even thought
Wow.
of it. I've known you in terms of exactly how I've put you together. And more powerful than DNA, I've created my image in you. And I've done that for every human on the planet. So you want to know what reconciliation looks like back to me and for helping people find their identity, help them see me. And it was just this
Wow.
defining moment of, wow, that's incredible. And from there, there was someone in that congregation that was part of a missions movement. They'd heard me speak. They contacted me and asked me to become the CEO of a missions movement that was global. And I had no experience in that, but yet I said yes. That was the courage part to step into it.
Wow.
Did that for
Yeah.
about 8 years. Took some time off, and then World Vision for the last 5. And over that period of time, especially World Vision, was such an amazing period in my life. Like just incredible opportunities and incredible things that you get to see on a global scale. One of them was working with an organization called Barna, who does a fair bit of research globally, and
Right.
um, and they did two generational pieces, right? One for Gen Gen Y,
Okay.
and one for Gen Z. And as we were doing it, and I mean, I don't know you, but if you've been around in kind of church world for very long, we love data. We love looking at some data. In fact, I coined the phrase that we love growing fat on data. The hard
Right.
part with data is actually looking at it to say, what are you actually going to do? What are you going to
Yeah.
change? And I remember 2011 being in churches and looking at the data coming out from then the age bracket of 18 to 25-year-olds saying these are the largest group leaving the church.
Mm.
And we're all like, wow, what are we going to do about this? It was like, how do we create almost youth groups for young adults? because
Right.
you can throw a chocolate night for a youth group and they'll turn up. But what do we need to do? And we didn't really solve it, right? And then when we we're
Mm,
looking at Gen Y and Gen Z, Gen Y actually came out and they were, out of the data, they were talking about the fact that they didn't want to just know something was true. They wanted to know that it was good. And it
right.
was, for me, as I dug into that more and more, I felt like it was a real wake up call to say, it's not just about the truth of who Jesus is. That's important to know about that truth,
Mm,
but actually, that truth embeds itself into your life when you truly see that following Him leads to goodness, and
right.
life is good, and that goodness can actually be found in all sorts of spaces. So, these two things shouldn't be separated. They should actually be working, in a way that supports one another. The truth of who
Mm,
Jesus is should lead to a life of goodness. And not only that, but it should lead to his kingdom showing goodness here on the earth. Even when a non believer experiences it, they should almost be smacked in the face with just how good it is.
right.
And Gen Y was really calling to that to say to the church, hey guys, don't just stand on pulpits and tell us about this. Show us. Show us
Right.
that it's good. And so again, it was this kind of, wow, are we doing that? And how are we doing that? And because in my experience, what we tend to do is we tend to separate out this idea of what it is that the church, or who the church is, what we practice, and
Mm,
the idea of mission, right? And the idea of mission that we've always had is like, hey, you're going to feel this call from God or hear this call from God, and then you're going to take your stuff, you're going to go overseas, you're going to raise support, you're going to do this stuff. But there's a dynamic shift that needs to occur, and I think that next generation has actually called this out, that mission isn't something you're called to. And this is a quote from a dear friend of mine who's spent a lot of time thinking about it. Mission isn't something you're called to. Mission is something you've been created for.
very
In
good.
in other words, every single fiber of our being, when you understand who you are, created in the image of God, it doesn't matter where you are, the conversation you're in, the place you're doing your vacation, it doesn't matter. The
Mm,
point is that you have been created for a purpose, and that purpose is to point to the King of Kings,
I love
and
that.
that can occur anywhere.
Yeah. That's
So
brilliant. Yeah.
it's this. Sorry.
No, no, no. I was just gonna affirm that's brilliant. It reminds me of the scripture in Ephesians 2 where it says you're God's workmanship created for good works which He's prepared beforehand. Just that sense of identity, like
100%.
you can't separate who you are from what you do. It's very much the missional focus, or following Jesus is about, it's that following, that doing, going into your workplace, going home, loving your wife, loving your children, loving your friend, wherever you
Yep.
find yourself, at the coffee shop, on a run,
Mhm.
or driving in the car. It's that taking that missional mind and that identity into your everyday.
100%. Now, if we flick from Gen Y to Gen Z was fascinating because when we started looking at the data that came out of that, there was a few points, and I mean, there was a lot of data, but there was a few points that really stuck out to me and started to tell a bit of a story. And I have a vested interest here, right? Because my boy turns 11 this year, so he's Gen Alpha. And
Right,
so the question for me, and he's got a beautiful little faith, right? And so my question was always around, what are we doing that's going to allow him to live out his God given gifts and potential, to be on mission and to understand that he's been created for God's purposes? And I mean, I am of the age where I'm really aware around the incredible legacy that has gone before us, that's allowed the life that I've lived, pointing to Jesus, and the opportunities that have been granted to me to do that in a miraculous way, have actually all been about, and not because of something that I've orchestrated or just something that's been in my lifetime, but because of the footprints of those that have gone before me, I followed. And
right.
and so I started being really interested around, well, who will Jesse, my little boy, who will he be following? If it's not me, who are those people in Gen Z and Gen Y that he's following? And
Right.
what legacy is he actually picking up? And so when you look at the data that comes out of Gen Z, there was a few things that I was acutely aware of. One, something popped up that I'd never seen before, right? Where 1 in 4 young people globally, aged between 12 and 17 right now, right, believe they'll be famous. 1 in 4.
Wow.
And it was like I had to stop and scratch my head as I looked at that. I was like, what? Because back when I was young, if you wanted to be famous, you had to be really good at something, you're best at your game, whatever it is. And you knew that it was a tiny, tiny percentage of people that would actually make
Mm.
it.
Yeah.
So what shifts to actually tell people, a young person, that actually 1 in 4 believe they will be? And what shifted is that you don't have to be the top 1% anymore. All you need is something to go viral in a digital realm that will
Right.
actually get your name out there. And so the fame picture has kind of shifted slightly. And the way in which be able to get there is actually all around, can you make someone laugh more? Can you get something that's be interesting, more violent, or whatever it is
Right.
that will allow cut through in a digital world. And so the huge difference between kind of when I'm growing up to watching Gen Z right now. The
Yeah.
other the other big thing that kind of came out was, and especially in Australia, that the number one concern that our young people in Australia have, 12 to 17, was around mental health.
Mm.
And, when you look at some of the data that's even just been posted recently, Australia's made it into the top 10 of countries around the world with worse mental health.
Yeah.
And when you look at, even outside of Gen Z, look at across our global statistics, it's 1 in 3, so it's 30% of people in Australia are experiencing and reporting emotional disconnection,
Mm.
right? And then if you look at the 12 to 17-year-olds, it's 1 in 2, so it's
Well.
50% of them.
Yeah.
And when we tie it in with the fact that they're more connected now globally than they've ever been, and yet they're still experiencing emotional disconnection, right? You got to start asking yourself why. If we've just said that we've been created for God's purpose, we've been created to be able to engage in with humanity in a really meaningful way, to point to His
Mm.
goodness, to understand that His image is created in every single one of us, and yet we've got a generation now that are more connected than anyone that's ever been in our globe, in a time where we've had more growth than we've ever had before, and yet they feel emotionally disconnected.
Right.
There is a problem between understanding our identity of what we've been created for and what the actual outworkings of that looks like.
Right. So
So
what would you say that problem is, or how are you looking to address it?
yeah, so I reckon, and again, this is my musings, right? So I'm currently in this process of doing my own kind of asking questions around
Mm.
how this works. But I reckon that there's a few things here. First of all, I would say culture has changed significantly, right?
Mm.
So when I was growing up, we understood our identity was found within mostly our family units in our community. So I call it a vertical relationship. So, in other words, you knew who you were by your family, your siblings, your parents, your uncles, your aunties, your community around you, your church, and then even your
Mm.
pastor. And eventually, the idea of this vertical nature leads you to understanding that there is a God over all of it. And you find yourself within this vertical nature, and it has some clear boundaries, which at times can be feel like it's restricting, but it's actually really safe because you're
Mm.
surrounded with people who know you, love you, see you, and want the best for you.
Right.
What we've kind of seen now is that, especially with the digital realm that's now in, that vertical relationship has toppled. So now I would say it's a horizontal space, right? So instead of a young person today finding their identity in their family of origin and their community that they're in, because it's now digital and global and it's really broad, what they've got is they've got their peers who don't necessarily know them, who are willing to cancel them, who they don't really necessarily have their best interests at heart, right? They'll exploit them wherever they can, and they're biting to all be seen, known, heard, and loved. And so it's
Right.
not as safe as it once was. Yes, you might be able to get cut through, but it's not actually going to help you because it's not in this structure that allows you to engage cross culturally and cross generationally in a meaningful way with people who have walked the journey with Jesus for a long period of time
Yeah.
to be able to speak into it. You know,
Yeah.
in church we'd call that discipleship, right? And so it's fascinating to watch this. Now, we're not going to be able to rebuild it for the next generation, but what I would love to see is that we take some of these hallmarks that help, every individual find themselves, be seen, known, heard, and loved, understand who Jesus is, what they've been created for, to find those principles put back in place in a way that a young person can actually build it for themselves.
Mm.
And that requires us not taking control, us actually releasing the reins, empowering them to do it, and walking alongside them to actually create safe environments for them to do this. So it's a fascinating kind of way to think through it in terms of our cultural, temperature of where Australia is right now. You go back
Mm.
3 generations, in back when the vertical kind of made sense.
Right.
People would actually, it was safe. It was producing better fruit. We were known for punching above our weight in terms of, our social service and I mean, you know, doing stuff around the world, responding to global issues, helping mates and neighbors. We understood that community and our neighbors a lot
Mm.
more. Whereas you look at it now, and yes, we actually be able to, we are more connected and more able to actually reach into certain things, but there is a disconnect from the head and the heart. It doesn't happen because I would say, and this is my second point, that what we've seen is this shift to a more me-centric culture.
Right.
So, and if we hold that up against the Bible, you know, Jesus actually tells us that we find ourselves when we die to ourselves.
Mm.
When we realize that that's not all about us, when we actually put to death our selfish pride and ambition, and instead we lay down our life for the benefit of others, we lay down our life to Jesus and say, "It's your way, it's your will, you are the
Mm.
master." That's when we truly find ourselves. So I would say we've progressively watched this, what I call the me switch, getting flicked on. And the beautiful thing about church and discipleship and understanding the community and the family of origin that you were in was that what that afforded you in a really simple way was for your me switch to be switched off. In other words, you are constantly reminded that life isn't about you. You're not the center of the universe.
Mm.
Nothing or not everything revolves around you. And we've seen a shift across the way in which we're parenting, the way in which we're doing culture,
Mm.
where actually your truth, your world, your feelings, your desires, that trumps everything else. And if it's felt
Right.
for you, it is important. And we watch this, and it's probably happened quite softly over a long period of time. But the underlying message is no, you are the most important person in the world.
Mm.
And so there's nothing there to actually help a young person turn their me switch off.
Mm.
And so what does that do? That doesn't actually help them find their identity that leads to health, that actually bears really good fruit. Instead, what it does is I think it's actually leading to the mental health issues that we're really seeing, because when
Mm.
you can't step out of your own world and realize and find empathy, find a desire to actually do good in the world, understand your place of how you can actually get on board with something else that's going on that's bigger than you,
Mm.
to broaden your horizon and vision and recognize that through relationship, that's how you grow your life. It's not in a digital realm. All these things mean that if you're not doing it, you're creating a world that is more and more just literally with you at the center.
Mm.
And then you see your flaws, you see your brokenness, you see all the shame, you see all the stuff that we know crowds our life, and that becomes the vision of yourself. And I
Yeah.
don't think it's what intended for a young person.
No, not at all. And I think, yeah, I think you're definitely on the money in terms of there's been a huge cultural shift from that sense of finding identity in a place of community and with others around to this, which Charles Taylor, who's a Canadian philosopher, calls like radical individualism. So it's
Hmm.
that me-centric focus of I have my truth. I like my truth is, even though it's subjective, it should be objectively like adhered to by everyone. So then you get into this like awkward situation, which I think we see unfolding now, where you have a bunch of opinions, but no one knows how to actually have conversation. Firstly, have like that open dialogue, but then offense creeps in and people feel attacked, they feel shamed, they feel all these things, and because those feelings are their truth, that's their world starts breaking down. And yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. I recently read a book by it's making its way around. It's called Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, and he talks more into the fact of how devices like these digital technology, these companies who are creating these devices, how essentially their main goal is to make a profit, and they're doing that at the expense of its users. So he unpacks like you're saying that Gen Alpha, Gen Z, because they're the generation who are being impacted mostly by digital advancements in screens and social media, and we see it from 2007 when the iPhone was introduced, and then this massive spike in mental health issues from 2010 onwards, when you get things like the like button, the share, the all these the endless scrolls, so all these
Yeah.
different things, and he ties it in saying in terms of how a young person, when they're growing and developing, they're looking for someone to look up to emulate. So there's this thing of prestige. They'll try and attach their identity to someone of prestige, and then they're also looking like around them, community, their peers, to be affirmed by that. So what social media then does is it puts, like you were saying earlier, like Insta famous or someone who's just gone viral, puts them in this prestige sort of position on this platform. So now you're looking up to this person who probably doesn't have much character. You're looking to them as an example, as I need to be like this person to be loved, accepted, and valued. And if you can't find that, then you're looking to your peers. But then what ends up happening, because you're not in a face-to-face relationship, it's all online, your peers are just showing highlight reels of their life. So you sort of come under this heavy condemnation of, man, I have to have the perfect life. I have to have the perfect relationship with my boyfriend, girlfriend. I have to have X, Y, and Z, you name it, and be able to post that so that I can get likes, so that I can feel valued and have this sense of identity. But the crazy thing is it's all based on, the social platforms are all based on that me-centric principle. Is like, you put yourself out there so you'll then get affirmed or loved, which is just, it's just a completely destructive way to add humanity to people, and a completely destructive way to try and see our young people flourishing in that environment. So I know you've done a lot of thinking in this space, and this is sort of somewhere you're wanting to enter into. How do you see yourself entering into that space and doing something about it?
Good question, and I'm still trying to work it out. I mean, look, one of the things that I have been doing is I have been speaking at a fair few schools as well, and talking through some of this stuff with young people, because you're quite right. Exactly what you've just named there and articulated really well is part of the biggest problem. I mean, if you look at some of those stats and how it aligns, you know, if you take out the 12 to 17-year-olds, the Gen Zs right now, they say that basically in Australia, we spend 30% of our waking time on digital devices. 30%.
Crazy.
If you go to 12 to 17s, it's more like 70% of their waking hours is spent on a digital device. And I would say that if we understand we've been created for more, we've been created to have large lives that impact and actually bump into one another, and actually speak life into one another's lives and sharpen each other and help each other actually get better and bigger. That only happens not through just how good we are, but it actually happens in understanding what the grace effect is when we see each other's flaws. And so what a screen does is a screen actually reduces the size of your life to only be seen through a 16:9 filter, whereas true relationship in an ongoing long period of time increases the size of your life, because you understand what it is to have grace, you understand what it is to love regardless, you understand what it is to forgive and have empathy and to help one another in their time of need and embrace person in pain, not only show the best snippets of a reel that actually paints a picture of a life that just isn't true.
Right.
And so the other part to this is that that's kind of where people are stuck in, and especially that next generation. But the other part in it is helping them realize that this is actually an addiction. You talk about people that are literally, their algorithms are discipling people because it is looking for, how do I keep them on board? So the stats are saying, and the research says for these companies, that kids these days, they don't have a long attention span. It's why videos are 3 minutes. They're not reading large bits of text. The
Mm.
education sector is actually needing to change the way in which they're engaging because of the fact that young people these days are showing very different ways of learning and engaging.
Mm.
And the reason is because it's been driven by a digital realm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and you see snippets all the time when you start looking for it.
Yeah.
Newspaper 2 days ago was this whole notion, this push to say we don't, schools are saying we don't want people or young people to bring their phones to school or into class, but they can have it in their bag. But what
Mm.
they're noticing at recess and lunch is that all the kids are rushing out to their bags, grabbing their digital devices out to see what they've missed. They're not outside, they're not playing, they're not talking to one another. They're literally only doing it through a digital device.
Yeah, it
And
causes
what
almost more of an issue. It's like you
causes more of
probably
an
have
issue?
to make schools a complete no phone zone.
No phone zone, right? And the reason they're playing with this is because what they're noticing is that young people's mental health is literally affected by feeling like they've spent too long away from it, they've missed out on something, or
Wow.
someone's actually hammering them online, or and it's this addiction that they cannot, release themselves from.
Mm.
So I think part of the answer is how do you build something in there that allows them to actually realize that you can be away from this thing and it's okay, that life's
Mm.
okay, it's going to continue on. It's not the real thing. That's not the real game. Now, I know I'm sounding old and fuddy, like, oh my goodness, technology is the worst. No, I don't think that at all. I think technology is amazing,
Right.
but I think that it should be built to help us with our purpose and our ultimate goal
Mm.
of understanding who we are, that we've been created for a purpose, and that purpose that gets played out into the earth so that people in pain can actually find hope, peace, joy, justice, love, all the stuff that we know that Jesus actually talks about.
Mm.
In other words, the other way to think about it is that God's kingdom can come here on earth,
Very good.
right? If that's what we're trying to really embed, that our culture needs to be a kingdom culture that has Jesus at the center of it, that brings restoration, love, grace, forgiveness. That's the way of life that actually leads to a mental health state, an emotional state, a spiritual state, a physical state that is our best version of ourselves.
Very
And
good.
and so the way in which we as a society needs to do this is because yes, we need to empower young people to be able to take control of this themselves, but we also need to set it up in a way where we are purposefully parenting differently. We're purposefully educating differently. We're purposefully pastoring differently.
Mm.
We're purposefully actually putting our attention onto that next generation so that they know that they're seen by us, that we can show that there is another way, that we can help them with the addiction of being on something. And I mean, I know I've said addiction a lot, but it's true. Like, I mean, some
Mm.
studies talk about the fact that this is, the digital device, you know, engagement is setting off endorphins in our brain that is not dissimilar to being on a hardcore drug.
Mm.
And I mean, if you're a parent with a kid and you watch them on a screen and you experience them after you take that screen away from it, it is literally like they're going into detox.
Yeah. Wow.
It's their whole mood, everything changes. And yet, it's not enough of an alarm bell for us to actually think through what are we doing here? Like, we there
Why?
needs to be
Why do you
something.
think that is? That's a great point, because I think so many people. I want to say parents of it. I feel parents are up close and personal with screens and that addictive behavior. So they're seeing it, but then also people experience it within themselves. I'm part of the millennial generation, so we we still have that pull towards the phone. And it's like you do feel like there's this addictive nature about it. And I think like the more and more time goes on, the more studies are coming out that how it's like in terms of the endless scroll and things like that, and the algorithms are likened to slot machines where they're designed to just give you little bits of dopamine hits every now and then, so that it keeps you hooked, it keeps you on. It's not like this one, like climbing a mountain, and then you feel the sense of, you get that dopamine hit, and you feel the sense of reward and accomplishment. But it's this thing that keeps you coming back for little bits, and those like micro interactions all add up to, like, what I forgot the stat you mentioned, how 70% of the time spent on the phone in a waking day. Um, why do you think there's not been as much attention from people on this, like it's a serious issue, right? This addictive nature of technology that we play with every day.
Yeah, I think part of it, because I've thought about this a fair bit too, and again, it's just my musings. Let's be clear. I don't have any hard data to back this up, right? But I think part of it is around it. It's hard work. It's hard work doing life,
Mm,
right? And when you have, kids, I think it's easy to be able to say or think to yourself, man, I just need a break. And so the easiest way to do that, to keep them out of mischief, is to chuck them a digital device and
mm,
say, here. And whether it's for 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever, or whether you lose track of time and all of a sudden 4 hours have gone by, it the intention is, I just need to be able to look after myself.
mm,
And, or I need a break, or I'm busy, or I'm cooking dinner, or whatever it is. And again, I know I sound so fuddy-duddy, but that that moment in time, like, I mean, if you think back to your childhood, some of your best memories of family life is your dad doing something with you, or your mum doing something with you, or doing something as a family, or
mm,
playing games in a car as you're going, or whatever it is, whatever your family would try kind of do. Um, those are the moments that stick in your head. It's
mm.
not a moment of, oh man, I that was so good my childhood because I was just given a screen. It's that's
Right.
not what we're going to be looking back on and saying. But I think there is this thing in life that is just so busy right now, and there's so much stuff going on, biting for our attention, that we've created this moment of what's the fastest way to be able to cut ourselves some time or a break.
Mm,
And I just don't think that's been a healthy. And it's as simple as we've gotten into the habit of doing it. So
right.
it's readily available. It's acceptable. It's not uncommon to walk into a cafe and see people there catching up, and when they want to have a meaningful conversation with someone, their kids are sitting there and they're giving them the phone,
Yeah.
right? And again, totally get it. Totally get it. You're trying to have a proper conversation, and your kid's sitting there and is making a mess or making a noise or doing something or running around like a crazy person. Everyone else is looking at you and judging you. So you
Mm,
just want to try and get them quiet. And the easiest way is to give them this thing. But the the downside of that is that it keeps the momentum of the endorphins and the dopamine hit actually occurring. It's having a poor impact on them. It's not teaching them good habits. It's not helping them enter into conversations. It's not helping them understand how you actually enter into a conversation with someone and have something a meaningful exchange. Instead, it's just keeping them quiet and doping them up and getting them into a pattern very early
mm.
that is leading to really poor mental health. I
Yeah.
mean, I read an article literally 2 days ago. It was so sad. A regional country town in Victoria, 17-year-old took their life because their whole world was on digital, and someone scammed them. They managed to actually get a photo of them that was
Mm,
that a naked photo of them as a response, pretending to be someone that they weren't, and all of
mm,
a sudden, you know, threatened to expose them, and this person just felt like they had no way out. The 17-year-old takes their life, and I look at that, and I'm just like,
shocking.
it's shocking. But can you imagine 20, 10, 15 years ago, 15 years ago, that never would have happened. It was not something that we were kind of looking at,
Yeah.
right? Because it wasn't there. That wasn't our world. It was
Mm,
seen as, well, that's a big deal. Who cares? That's a nothing world. That's not my life. Whereas
yeah.
it's now so it's so ingrained in who we are now that
Mm,
actually it just opens up this really sad moment in our history that allows people to actually just do harm.
yeah.
So,
That's
I just think that part of it too is, if we come back to Deuteronomy, right, and we think about even the guide of what it looks like in, as followers of Jesus, in community, in family, to think about this and care for one another. It talks around the fact that from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, we should be talking about the ways of God. We should be pointing to His goodness. We should be reminding the next generation, our kids, exactly what He's done, how He's turned up in those moments of difficulty. How He's delivered us from stuff,
mm,
and the whole purpose of that is so that we don't forget who He is, and we keep expecting that He's going to keep doing it.
mm,
And so that is a practice that I think actually looks like a family life, a community life that has a really different rhythm to it, to trying to actually just find enough space in our time by giving our kids, our young people, a digital device to help them be quiet for enough time for us to be able to feel like we get a
Mm.
break. And I just think we need to reset the dials and start again.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think there's that need for intentionality, but I'm hearing at the same time, obviously, there's a lot of empathy that goes out into those situations with parents and their kids. I've got a 2-year old, and we've sort of made as much as we can a hard stance at this stage, to not involve screens in her life. But it is so tempting when you making a hour and a half trip down south to visit family or something like that, and the wheels are coming off the bus and there's Cheerios flying all around the car, and it's like, oh, like, Lord, just give me the strength to to carry on. So I get that empathy side, but there is that intentionality of like, okay, well, what is this decision that I'm making now? How is it going to play forward? And that I think it's important what you mentioned. It's that habitual, when it becomes that rhythm or that thing that you just lean to, instead of leaning to something good and healthy, which may be hard in the time, is really important. And another, in terms of thought that I had as you're speaking, is that question of like, who are we being discipled by? So I think whoever we're all being shaped and formed by something. It's not a question of like what should we be shaped and formed, or what should we be discipled by, but it's more of a question of like, what are we being discipled by? And if Jesus isn't that center, then we without even realizing, that's where I empathize as well, is without even realizing, then our culture shapes us. The world around us shapes us, and like we said at the start of this conversation, the culture has turned to very me-centric.
Yeah.
And it's this this narrative that leads away from goodness, away from what Jesus has to offer, that life. So how have you gone out to address that question of like, who are we being discipled by? It's that identity question again. It's like, how have you gone out to address and want to bring out a different way, a better way to shape and form Gen Zs and Gen Alphas?
Yeah. So what I've just started is this thing called Abel Movement, right? And look, it's in its infancy, right? So I'm still working on websites, I'm still working on all these things, but the thought is this, Caleb, is that whatever movement's on about is it's wanting to be able to produce a different culture, or create a different culture, and let it be led almost back to biblical times, right? When the early church first came out, right? We look at Acts. That what were they doing? They were embracing people in their pain, and it says that God actually added to their number every single day. In other words, they got into the habits of meeting in homes. They ate. They shared their possessions. They shared belongings, and they did really cool stuff together, and recognized that the circumstance didn't define them. They could actually create a different culture within that,
Mm.
right? One that actually existed on hope and restoration and forgiveness and love. And it wasn't about the pervading culture. I mean, recognizing that their pervading culture at that time was one of oppression, was incredibly hierarchical, that
Mm.
they were seen as nothing. And all of a sudden, we've got Jesus totally changing this thing on its head.
Mm.
Now, you fast forward to today, and if we think about again, what are some of the pivots, the pivotal moments in that? It's understanding that the habitual things that we need to start doing needs to echo some of these things. So, in other words, how do you continue to eat meals together? Like even in a small way, if a family just decided, hey, mealtime, there's no technology, we're actually going to have a conversation. We're going to ask each other how we're doing. We're going to share around this moment in time. That could be absolutely transformational in a household,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Again, not a new idea, something
Yeah.
that has been practiced since the beginning of time, and and but I mean, I reckon if you did a snapshot of how many people would actually just eat their dinner alone or in front of the TV, or
Mm.
family time, still got their phones and they're scrolling through stuff and laughing, and I mean that I'm sure it's not intentional around, no, we're going to have a conversation.
Mm,
We're going to ask each other how we're actually doing here.
mm,
And so I think something as simple as that could really change it. Anyway, what I'm thinking about with Abel is a few things going on. One, I want to I want to create some conversations that can trial some things that are different.
mm.
So, what does it look like to do family life differently? Like you mentioned that the hard stop on screens. Jesse's 11 now, same thing. From Monday to Friday, there's no screens or technology whatsoever for him. And I mean, that's been difficult. And at times we've not done it. At times
Right.
we've done it really well. But, looking at it over the last 11 years, I think to myself, he's been set up better for it,
Mm,
or because of it, because he interacts better with people. He'll ask good questions. He'll engage differently. Yes, there's been times where there's conversation of I feel left out because everyone else at school's talking about X, Y, and Z, and I don't get to do that.
mm,
And we explain, hey, it's okay. We're going to do something different here, or we're going to do a different activity, or
mm,
it's now. And I know it sounds extreme, but it's almost like a test to see what it can produce.
mm,
And not that he's perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but some of the pitfalls that we notice in some of the other young people around him, it's different. The things aren't the
mm.
same. And I would argue that in Able Movement, what we want to do is we want to be able to help families do this. We want to help parents understand some of these biblical principles that where they can try that's different, that will produce some different results in their kids, that will be some habitual changes that they can make that may actually help support them, connect them back into community with other parents to support them and be in that space with them, provide them
Very
with
good.
resources to do that. Same thing with pastors and churches, like, I mean, I love the church and think it's God's answer to the world. And but I think that at times as the church we've missed some of this stuff. We've kept staring inside the four walls instead of recognizing that there's a big bad world out there that desperately needs us to remove our walls, stop
Very
trying to
good.
protect ourselves and start trying to get out there to help people recognize that Jesus is accessible for everyone and has
Mm,
something to say to everyone. And I think, pastors, the biggest thing that we struggle with is kind of the pressures of how do we make sure people are turning up? How do we make sure there's enough money in the plate? How do we make sure that
mm,
we're doing the things that we've set out to do that's been God given? And yet, so what that does is that the temptation of wanting to control everything is right there. So
mm,
what if you took the mantle to say control is an illusion, and instead you actually embrace the mystery of God to say, what are you going to do in this next generation, and hand over the reins a bit more to say, lead.
mm,
I wonder if all of a sudden we'd see them do something really differently.
mm,
And, and then for young people, engaging with them in a way to say, you guys have the power to be able to do something differently here. It's not around hearing from me or anyone else to say, hey, follow me. I'm going to actually help you with this. I'm going to stand on a platform and preach at you.
mm,
But what if you were able to actually lead a peer to peer led movement that was gathering people simply to do something different? So instead of being online constantly, you're gathering them in your spaces that you naturally are, whether it's your schools, your churches, your community sporting clubs, wherever you may be,
mm,
gathering like-minded people, your peers, to say, let's stop and pray. let's
mm,
let's wait on God and see what he has to say. Let's
mm,
remind each other of who we are in him. And then let's pick something that is on our heart and do something about it.
mm,
I have this funny inkling that if we can do that and almost keep it underground and secret and just let the thing kind of bubble away, that we would look back in 5, 10 years time and go, what happened? Like
mm,
what? Because I guarantee it'll impact culture. And the reason I say that is because we've got 2,000 plus years of history watching how Jesus impacted culture with
mm,
his people that were all over the map, all over the shop, imperfect in every way, but honed in on the kingdom of God principle of they can bring goodness here on earth. And
mm,
they did it by devoting themselves to the word, to the breaking of bread, meeting in each other's homes, and sharing each other's pain.
mm.
And if we can start to create cultures back like that, it will have an impact.
Awesome. So, just on that, what have you noticed the particular gaps in, say, the church or in youth ministries, particularly, to address these needs and issues that we've chatted about and that you've spoken about, that um, Gen Zs, Gen Alphas are facing on an increasingly detrimental level?
Yeah, look, we as the church, we don't have an easy job ahead of us. Let's be clear.
Mm,
Like it's hard work. It used to be that, and I mean, if we think historically, Australia was set up as as a Christian nation historically. That's what we were. So churches on every corner. Understanding that that's what we're being created in. right? And we live in this beautiful kind of space right now that has this very Christian heritage of our education system, our government systems, our hospitals, all of that comes from this very biblical idea of what it looks like to engage with humanity.
Mm.
Now, so the old models that we had of church of turning up, doing the thing, calling people to come, and then just turning up and us being able to speak to it, that's no longer working. And I mean, I think the global pandemic, it smashed us, in terms of people turning up and people actually feeling like they were part of a community. Now, I would also throw in there that, while it would be easy to point and say, oh, the church disappeared, or we lost a whole heap of people from community, I would argue that Jesus didn't stop working. I think it would be really interesting to do a cross-cultural setting and say, hey, all the people that belonged in a church over the period of COVID, what did you do in terms of connecting with your neighbors and still
Mm.
having incredible God conversations that you can point to? I'm sure there'd be way more than we realize. So I still believe the church was alive and well during that period of time. It's just that the gathering point and the way in which we measured it had shifted dramatically and has still shifted. So I think what we're now seeing is we're seeing this moment where we need to start to think through differently of what we're doing. The old models of just plant in a vertical nature that actually has this hierarchical moment that tries to get young people to see God at the top of it, that's gone.
Mm.
So what are we doing now to try and feel like we're planting seeds in a horizontal spectrum
Mm.
that allows a young person to lead themselves and be there to create safety for them? It's back to what I said earlier. So I think part of the models and the issues that we have of just gathering on a Friday night or gathering on a Sunday and saying this is where you come and this is where you belong and we're going to have some fun and laughter, etc. You know, that as its almost shop front,
Mm.
I think can work still, but it's a difficult one because it's a very difficult place to really get meaningful and see um, what I would call God movements taking off or doing something. And the reason I'm convicted by that is because if you look back through history, every amazing movement that's ever occurred has usually started with a young person that before they've figured out they can't do it, they do it.
Mm.
And it's because they have this unholy discontent with what they're seeing coming down the line.
Brilliant.
Now, are we creating that space for that to occur? And my sense is no, we're not. We're creating gatherings that again have are a moment in time for us to feel like we can gather and feel like we're checking some boxes.
Mm.
But to really think through what does it look like in ministry that's 7 days a week, not just an hour on a Friday night or an hour on a Sunday.
Mm.
How are we leaning into that space? And that means that it's not just the pastor's role or the youth leader's role. It's actually all of our roles. It's
Mm.
it's anyone that follows Jesus that understands they're part of his church and a part of his bride need to take that ministry seriously to say, how are we investing in this next generation in a way that is going to, one, help them be the best version of themselves they can be, so that they can be on mission and understand that they've been created for it, not called to it,
Mm.
and will have the longevity of a church that keeps pointing to the bride of Christ in a way that brings goodness in this world because his kingdom can't help but be here on earth when his gatherers are actually serious about this. So it's almost a recalling to say the church, we need to remember that our primary purpose here is pointing to God, and our primary purpose is about equipping the saints for their work in ministry, which
Mm.
is ministry that isn't shiny and amazing and has big platforms, but ministry that is every single day, that is conversation by conversation, moment by moment, back to that Deuteronomy moment of saying,
Mm.
can you imagine if you were leading a church where every family member in that place took it seriously, that from the moment the sun
Mm.
came up to the moment it went down, they're talking about the goodness of God and reminding
Brilliant.
each other the fact that he's here.
Yeah, I'm sure that would significantly transform and shape the culture that we're a part of. And how beautiful would that look as well?
I believe it would be absolutely incredible.
So it sounds like you've definitely got your work cut out ahead of you, Noddy. And yeah, if people wanting to find out more about you or get in contact with you, maybe someone listening feels like, hey, they're working on a project or they feel like they have something to contribute or might just be able to, yeah, do something about it with you or whatever it may be, what's the best way for that to occur?
Mate, if someone's listening and they feel like they want to help me with this, I will take all the help I can get. 'Cause right now, it's me. So, Small
Brilliant.
I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at noddy@abelmovement.org. That's Abel as in ABEL, which, by the way, we haven't touched on, but my whole thing is that it came from Cain and Abel.
Right. Yeah. Well,
And
just give us a overview to where the name did come from.
all right, so I'm sitting there and I'm looking at it. I needed to come up with this name for this thing, and I'm flicking through the Bible, and pretty much first thing that popped off the page was, Cain and Abel. And of
Right.
course, we know this story, right? Cain and Abel are brothers. Abel brings his offering to God. It's pleasing. Cain brings his, and it's less than. And, so Cain, out of comparison and realizing that it's not as good, thinks to himself, I just need to kill Abel, and then I can be pleasing with God.
Wow.
Now, first of all, I find that really fascinating because he had two choices. Cain could have gone, all right, I really need to fix something about this. So how do I get better? But instead of saying that, he said, no, that's making me look bad. How do I kill it?
Right.
And I would say, we're in a generation now and a cultural time where we've experienced that. We've seen the amazing work of what the church of what followers of Jesus have done globally. And we've seen a world that says, oh, we need to get better. Or how do we get more engaged in that? And instead they've gone, how do we kill that? How do we actually take it out of our classrooms? How do we no longer let it, be here? How can we actually have this as opt-in,
Mm.
And so we've watched this whole thing almost kind of come under a bit of persecution. And the word Abel, or the name Abel in Hebrew, actually literally means vapor or breath of God. And
Wow.
while we may see a generation right now who have almost tried to kill off this idea that God's in existence, that he has truth, that there is an absolute truth, that Jesus has something to say to them, I would say that there are a group of young people who I believe that they are still able. In other words, they are the vapor and the breath of God, and they
Awesome.
can do something that's incredible. And so I kind of feel like our role in this right now is if we can identify where the breath and the vapor of God exists, then how do we actually empower it and release it to do something great in our world?
Brilliant.
So if people want to join me in it, I'd love to hear from them. Email me. The website will be up shortly. And, when that's up, we can jump back on and have a look, and people can contact me through that as well. But yeah, I'd love to hear people's thoughts and what they're doing. And if they're keen to actually get engaged, it would be awesome.
Awesome. Sounds good. I'll throw up your email if you're fine with it in the description as well, so people can find it easier
Okay.
as well if they need to shout out to you.
Thanks,
Great.
mate.
Well, thanks so much for your time and your conversation. And yeah, it sounds really, I suppose the task ahead isn't an easy one by any means, but it's a necessary one. So thanks for sharing a bit about that and your heart and your passion for seeing the breath and the life of Jesus in the generations to come to continue to shape our culture and the lives around us. I think it's so needed, and yeah, it's beautiful, and I've really enjoyed this convo, Noddy. So thanks again. Chat soon.
Caleb, thank you, mate.